Can you all see the slides?
Yes, sir.
All right. So in the last class, we were almost completed the progress of rice improvement program in Sri Lanka, right? So we were looking at different events of different milestones, right? Through which we have achieved this improvement in Sri Lanka, right? Are there any questions before we get into the new section? Okay, if you don't have questions, I will just brief it, right? So we were looking at what has happened before 1930s, and then what they were doing is, they were isolating some pure lines from the traditional varieties, right? So that's the second step. And then, because of the drawbacks we had with the traditional varieties, we wanted to introduce some exotic varieties from other countries, right? In that case, we were bringing some varieties from Indonesia, India, right? And then the one of the major step, that is the fourth one, right? That's the variety development through hybridization and selection, right? So in this hybridization and selection, it has happened in two phases, right? In the first phase, right, what we were developing was the old improved varieties, right? So I said that the H4 was the first such variety, right? We have developed in the phase one, right? And then in the phase two, we have developed the newly improved varieties, right? In parallel to the green revolution occurred in the Asian region, right? In many countries, including India, Indonesia, Philippines, right? So then I said that this particular mutant, right, that has this short characters like dwarf characters, was included into this breeding program. Like we call it as DGOWG, right? DGWG, right? So, but our scientists, right, they were not happy with this particular, right, variety. So they wanted to take a semi-dwarf variety from Indonesia, right? That was in Pinkatek, right? To develop the newly improved varieties. So according to that development, right, the first newly improved variety was VG1111, right? So that was the duration of 4 to 4.5 months, right? And after that, right, they thought that, right, this is still has long duration. So we have issues in cultivating this particular variety for 2 seasons, right? So they thought we have to bring down the duration. So we have to develop short duration varieties around 3.5 month age classes, right? So then it will facilitate the cultivation in 2 seasons whenever you have water, right? Irrigation facilities. So under that thinking, right, there are 2 popular varieties developed. That was DG300 and DG352, right? The first one is a 3-month variety, and then second one was a 3.5 month variety, right? So during the period of 1990s, right? But still, right, still 50% of the annual cultivated extent occupied by these 2 varieties, DG300 and DG352, right? Because of their short duration and popular among the consumers and farmers, right? And then I explain you this particular graph, right? That shows, with the time, right, how the different varieties replaced, right, the total extent cultivated in Sri Lanka, right? If you look early years, 1950s, 100% was traditional ones, right? Then the improvement of old improved varieties started in late 1950s, right? So then the newly improved variety improvement occurred in late 1960s, right? Around 1970, right? So currently, majority of them, around 97-98%, we cultivate are the newly improved varieties, right? Newly improved varieties. Okay, so then if you look this timelines, right? So after this variety development, hybridization, right? So we had something like future varietal improvement strategies. So I just want you to give an overview, right, of what the future of this varietal improvement program will look like, right? How what are the improvements we can do, right? Using different techniques, and already there are some techniques already applied, right? So we are going to have an overview. The reason is that even though we have developed right this newly improved varieties, right? Now there are so many newly improved varieties, released by different agricultural research stations across the country, right? We have still problem of something called yield ceiling, right? Yield ceiling, because after certain yield potential, we were unable to, right, increase their yields, right? So our population is continuing to increase, right? If you want to maintain the self-sufficiency in rice, right, we need continuous improvement, especially in yield, right? So there are some techniques we can apply, and already they are practicing, right? So some of them are like the first one is mutation breeding, right? And hybrid rice, right? And then new plant type, and then biotechnological tools we can use, right? So I will just give an overview, right? Because you don't need to know this in detail, but whenever you come across with any reading material regarding this, at least I have to give some exposure to you, right? So under the mutation breeding, right, you may have studied in the biology, right? Advanced biology also we study what is mutation, right? So mutation is a source of genetic variable, right? So this mutation you can induce artificially, you can induce, right? So this semi-dwarf variety, right, we talk about, right? Which varieties we have used in developing newly improved varieties. Actually, they were developed by induced mutation, right? So using chemicals, or maybe you can use radiation, or maybe some enzymes, right, to generate these mutants, right? So the mutation is a source of genetic variability. So if you can use this as a tool, right, to induce genetic variability, that is preferable, right? That character should be preferable, right? Maybe it can give you high yield, or maybe a dwarf plant, or maybe a resistant, right? Whatever it is, the preferable trait or preferable character. So if it can give you, right, you can use this tool, right, as a breeding technique. Okay, so that's all you need to know at this stage. Okay, so that's the first one. And then this is another important one you should know, right? The hybrid rice, right? So this hybrid rice technology actually developed in China, right? China, it's one of the country which produce a lot of rice, right? A lot of rice. So this is the scientist. He is the scientist Yuan Longping, right? He was known as the father of hybrid rice, right? Hybrid rice. So if you remember, right, when I briefly explained the breeding, right, breeding or develop, when you develop this old improved variety uh, and newly improved varieties, right? So we said that it's a hybridization and selection, right? So this is different from that, right? So you should not confuse with hybrid rice with the conventional breeding, right? So that is hybridization and selection. So what we will do is in the in developing the newly improved varieties or all the improved varieties, you will have parents, right? That is two varieties, right? So you cross them, right? You will get a hybrid, right? That's true. That's F1, right? But that will produce like because you will have two parents, right? So then it will produce the planting material, that's seeds, very less amount, right? And then you have to multiply. So this multiplication goes through generations, right? Goes through generation. At least you have to go 7 8 generations to stabilize the characters. So that's how we develop the old improved varieties or newly improved varieties, right? So they are called as inbred lines. Maybe I can write here, right? Can you see this one?
Yes.
So they are called as inbred lines. They are different from hybrid, right? Because the technique involved is different here. Okay. So the so again in the hybrid rice, developing hybrid rice also you will have, right, two varieties. Two varieties always involved because they are the parents, right? But you don't want to stabilize the characters. You don't go through generations. But in the first F1, right? F1 you use as a planting material, that's seed, right? So the hybrid rice varieties will have, right, whenever you cross two different varieties, so that is they will have two different genetic makeup, right? Genetic makeup. So when you cross them, right, we usually we will get what it called as heterosis. Heterosis or hybrid vigor, right? So because of this hybrid vigor, right, they will produce high yield, especially if you are targeting that particular correct, right, producing high yield, right? But the problem with this heterosis is that, right, this is not a stabilized variety, right? So you always need that seed, right? Because if you go to F2, right, F2, then there will be a lot of variations, right? You will study that in genetics, right? I don't want to go into detail, but you should know the basic, right? So if you use that as F2, then it will produce a lot of variations. So this is like maybe I can write here. So you will have a parent P1, right? And then there's another parent P2, right? So you will get F1. So this is the one your hybrid, right? So every time you have to purchase this seed, right? Hybrid seed for hybrid rice. Every time you have to purchase the seed because you cannot use this seed if it is F2, right? If you use this F1 seed, right, that is F2, right? Then what you will have is a lot of variations in the population. So that will not give you the expected yield or whatever the correct, right? Because of this heterosis, right? So this F1 used as a seed, right? So you have to always purchase if you want to grow hybrid rice, you have to purchase the seed, and then it's expensive, right? Um, and another important thing you should remember this one is that rice is self-pollinated crop, right? Self-pollinated crop. So it's very difficult to avoid, if you want to do targeted crossing, right? It's very difficult for you to control, right? That same pollen, falling into the female part, right? So in that case, you have to develop a variety with male sterility, right? that doesn't produce fertile pollens, right? So you have to have a variety, right, with male sterility. Otherwise, you cannot simply avoid the self-pollination. So in that case, in the hybrid rice, you may encounter this term. It's called cytoplasmic male sterility, right? So that particular line is required. So you have to get that, right? So in developing this cytoplasmic male sterility, right? In this kind of rice varieties, if you take a rice variety with cytoplasmic male sterility, it will not produce fertile pollens, right? So then you can bring the pollens from other plant, right, and insert it into the female part, right? Then successful pollination, then fertilization, right? So this technique, actually, this technique was required for this development of hybrid rice. So this particular scientist, right, Yuan Longping, right, from China, so he was successful in developing this, right? So that's why we say this technology is developed in China, right? This technology has developed in China. So as I said, since they have this hybrid vigor, right? Hybrid vigor. So in the field of China, right, where they have developed, they realized that this rice variety, the hybrid rice, can achieve yields around 18 tons per hectare, right? 18 tons per hectare, right? So anyone can remember what is the average yield of Sri Lanka currently? Like I said before. What is that? Can you remember? At least the range. Yeah, that's correct. Right? It ranges in between 4.5 to 5, right? Okay. So this technology also adapted in Sri Lanka, right? By the scientist at Batalagoda, right? So the first hybrid rice in Sri Lanka is BG407H, right? So it was released in 2005. It was a white pericarp rice, right? There are two. Nominally, we have red and white, right? So this was white, released in 2005. So it's BG. BG indicates Batalagoda, right? You are now aware about that one. 407H, H indicates the hybrid, right? It's a hybrid rice. That's all about hybrid rice, okay? And then this is a kind of a concept, right? Maybe adapted in some countries in Asia, but not in many countries. So they are thinking about a new plant type, right? It's called as new plant type. Sometimes they call as idiotype, right? So can you see this?
Yes.
Okay. Right. So this kind of improved architecture, right? Improved architecture in rice plants, right? They wanted to reduce the tiller number, right? The rice has so many tillers around this main stem, so we call it as culm, right? Because it's a grass, right? So we don't call it as stem, right? So it's a culm. So around that we have so many tillers, right? Like this. So they wanted to reduce the tiller number because they think that these tillers are not that much productive, right? Because in the tillers you will get panicle and grains, right? So they thought that these tillers when they are high in number, right, and they are not that much productive, right? So they wanted to reduce this tillers, number of tillers, and then make those tillers with heavy panicles, right? So then they can produce high yield, right? So in that case, what they are believing is that the assimilates, right? Can anyone tell me what you mean by assimilates? At least if you know. Okay, in that case, I will tell, right? Assimilates, or sometimes we call as photosynthase, right? Maybe I will write it here. So these are the products of photosynthesis, right? So assimilates or photosynthetes are the products of photosynthesis in any crop, right? So these assimilates usually they are translocated, right? When they initiate panicles and produce grains, right? So they are translocated towards these developing grains, right? So what will happen if there are so many tillers and they are not that much productive, right? These assimilates which are translocated towards these grains will be wasted, right? Will be wasted. So they wanted to reduce that, right? They wanted to reduce that. So through reducing the ineffective tillage. Use and huge improvement of rice production in that country. Right. So then there are some advanced technologies coming, right? At least you should know this, what are those, right? So you can use the biotechnology to improve the rice varieties. Right now, there are a lot of techniques coming up. For example, genetic sequencing, right? And then we can use the mark assisted breeding, right, and selection. So this is a particular technique. Maybe when you study genetics, or maybe you might be right familiar with this, right? The genes are responsible, right, for particular characters, right? So if you uh, have an identification for them, right, in the breeding program, so then you will not need to wait for them to show the morphological characters in the field, right? So it will rapid up the breeding process, breeding work, right? And then there are tools like genome editing, right? So these advanced techniques nowadays used by the rice breeders, especially to develop disease or pest resistant varieties. Or maybe we have to develop resistant varieties for abiotic stresses like drought, salinity, right, heat stress, or maybe iron toxicity, right? I said in the last class, right, in the wet zone, we had now I see around 114, right, 114. Now that's maybe a good number, but it's still missing like 20 meters, right? Okay. Any questions? Yeah. Yeah, genetic sequencing in like, so since you asked this question, right, this is a little bit advanced to you, but I can explain, right? Um, you know that each and every crop, right, will have varieties, right? Those are the variation within the particular species, right? So if so that made because of their genetic makeup, right? How this right the genes, right, arranged in such a way that that reflect in the morphology as characters, right? Characters, right? So if you can take a particular variety and study all the genes, right? All the genes and their characters, right? You have to identify the gene for the particular character, right? So if you can do that, right, and have a record of that, right? Because this genetic sequencing now we record as a data, right? Data, right? It's an emerging field, right? So you can, it's called as genomic data, right? Genomic data. So you can, you can study this one and have a record of it, right? Then you will know, right? You will know what is the gene responsible for particular character. For example, some you can know a particular gene is responsible to the resistant in rice blast, right? So then you can use that particular gene in breeding program. You can incorporate that. So then you can develop a resistant variety for rice blast, right? So that's how this genetic sequencing is used. Okay, is it clear to you now? Right. Okay. So thank you for that question. And any other questions? So you have to ask questions like this, then only you can learn. Otherwise, it's just, remembering and writing the exam. It doesn't make any sense, right? Any questions? So if I ask, right, to you to briefly, right, explain, what has happened through this rice development program, can you write an essay, everyone?
Yes, sir.
So let's see in the exam, okay? Okay, so so since you don't have any other questions, so remember you can always ask questions from the previous class as well, right? So when you study, right, if you encounter any issues, you can ask, right? Whenever I give time. Okay, so that we we stop that particular section and starting this is kind of a new section, right? Ecological requirements of rice, right? Can you see the slides?
Yes.
All right. So when we say, right, ecological requirement, right, in the first class also I have explained what are the components the cropping system has, right? It has dominantly two components. One is above ground environment and below ground environment. We said that in the above ground environment, the dominant one is climate, right? And the below ground environment that is made up of soil, right? Soil environment, right? So under the climate requirement, so when we study the ecological requirement for any crop, right, not only for rice, right, we talk about climate and then soil, right. So under the climate requirements, you will have these are the major components, or maybe you can say as parameters, whatever it is, right. So we have to study the solar radiation, how it affects, right, and then temperature requirement, right. You cannot grow the crops under any temperature, right? They have their preferred ranges, right? And then relative humidity, right? That accounts for the the vapor content, water vapor content in the atmosphere, right? That is measured in terms of RH, right? Relative humidity. And then wind, right? And then water. Maybe it's through rainfall or maybe through irrigation, right? If you have water to irrigate, anyway, the water requirement is there, right? So those are the climate requirements, right? So sometimes you may argue that, right, you cannot put water under the climate requirements, but you can always put. The reason is that, the water, the source is primary source is rainfall, right? Even though you irrigate from the surface water sources like tanks or maybe reservoirs, right? Or maybe groundwater using the wells, right? The primary source is rain, right? Rainfall. And then under the soil requirements, the soil will have these three major components, right? The physics of the soil, chemistry, and biology, right? So the physical properties, chemical properties, and biological properties all will affect, right, the crops, right? So we have to study that, right? Then in terms of solar radiation requirement, right, for rice, right? This is, the tropical crop, mostly grown in the tropical climate. So that's mean the climate around the equator, right? Where we can receive high amount of sunlight, right? Sunlight, right? So in this is a very famous graph, right? But you should know just what it briefly means, right? Right? In this, right, x-axis, right? X-axis, you will have different growth stages of rice, right? So it's starting from seedling emergence, right, and first tiller, right? So we will study in the next classes, right, detailing the growth stages in detail. But I also had a one class, right? So just I brief about the important growth stages, right? So you may be familiar with this one, right? But for the understanding of this particular graph, right? So in the x-axis, we have different stages of growth. So starting from seedling emergence, then first tiller, right? Panicle initiation, right? So that's the initiation of the panicles, right? And then first heading, right? So that's, after panicle initiation, we have a stage called heading, right? And then this is medium duff. Duff stage means, after they produce grains, right? So this is the stage of one of the stages in the maturity, right? And then we have the last, the maturity, right? In the y-axis, you have this sunlight requirement, right? As a percentage, right? As a percentage of the, what we generally receive in a daytime, right? In a daytime, in a tropical country, right? Tropical country. So that is in percentage they mentioned, right? So you see here, this is the graph that shows the solar radiation return, right? So from the seedling emergence, right, when it slowly producing leaves, right, it will start solar radiation requirement increases, right? It's around, earlier it was, less than 50% was enough, right, for the seedling emergence. First 50% of the full sunlight, right? Less than 50 was enough. But it gradually increases, right? Increases and reaches like around 80-85% here, right? Is required, right? And the panicle initiation, right? Panicle initiation. Then it continuously increases, right? And reaches maximum at the heading stage, right? It's around 100, right? Full sunlight is required, right? Full sunlight is required during this particular stage, heading stage, right? And then it gradually reduces, right? After that, it produces grains and it goes towards maturity, right? So then it decreases, the requirement decreases. So this pattern you should know, right? And then they have an area, right? Uh, Let me erase this one, right? So they have an area, right, shaded area right here, right? So they say that this is the critical solar radiation requirement period, right? From the chemical initiation to the medium and off stage, right? So this is the critical because during this, right, this is a kind of reproductive stage, right? Reproductive stage, the flowering, pollination, and then fertilization and translocation of assimilates toward developing grains, everything occurs, right? So because of that, the shaded area they see as critical sunlight period. But it doesn't mean that, other stages they don't require. But, this is the time period they need to have at least the sunlight requirement more than 80%, right, during these stages, right? So this is kind of a general sketch, right, how this solar radiation requirement varies with the stages of growth in rice, right? Stages of growth in rice. Is that clear? Are there any questions? Students, are there any questions?
No, sir.
All right. So, but you should know this graph, okay? So you have to know these stages, right? And then these values in the y-axis, right? So that's just simple, right? In percentage, you know what is the available sunlight accumulated. Right, regarding then, so we have finished the solar radiation requirement, right? Let's go to the temperature requirement for rice, right? So as I said, rice is a crop of tropical climate, right? So the climate like we have in Sri Lanka, right? So that's a tropical climate, right? However, right, it's also grown in successfully in humid to subhumid regions under the subtropical and temperate climate, right? In some other countries, but mainly in the tropical countries, right? But it can be grown, right, if the range of temperature is available. So the average temperature required throughout the life period, right, throughout the life cycle of this crop usually ranges 21 to 35, right? So that is the maybe you can say a preferable range of temperature uh, during the life cycle of this particular crop, right? But there are problem arises, right, when the temperature increases, right? When the temperature increases, right? So what, especially during the reproductive stage, reproductive stage. So what will happen is, right? This is finding from a research, right? From a finding from a research. So what we observe is the rice grain sterility, right? Sterility, right? They don't produce grains, right? When the spike like temperature, right, rises above 30 degrees Celsius, right, and complete sterility, right, reached at 36, right, 36 degrees Celsius. Because after pollination, they become sterile, right? They don't convert into grains because the fertilization get affected, right? So this chance for this sterility increases, when you increase the temperature above 30, right? But it will become completely sterile, right, at 36 Celsius, right? Especially when you have a high relative humidity around 90%, right? So relative humidity also uh, has an influence here, right? So this is a research finding. So we have to right, that's how this the low yield occurs in high temperature conditions, right? So we have to make sure that we grow in an environment um, that is below maybe 30 or maybe at least 35, right? So 20 to 35, right, is reasonable range, right? But when you increase the temperature above 35, because of this sterility problem, yield drastically go down, right? So that's why I put the optimum temperature could be this temperature, 25 to 30. Under the low temperature also yield may be less because of this. The rate of metabolism is low, right? Photosynthesis is low, right? So this particular range you can say optimum for rice production throughout the season, right? Throughout the season, right? That's kind of a temperature requirement it has. And then if you take the relative humidity and wind, right? Wind requirement, right? So the optimum relative humidity for rice cultivation ranges between 60 to 80%, right? 80%. Students, can you please stop and share? Can you hear me? Interruption. So now you can see the slides as well, right?
Yes.
Okay, so the optimum RH, right, for rice is ranging between 60 to 80, right? In Sri Lanka, majority of the rice growing locations have RH of 80 to 85%, right? 80 to 85%. That's fine with the rice cultivation in Sri Lanka because if you take our country, it's an island, right? Yeah, so most of the areas, most of the lowland, uh, low country dry zone areas where rice is cultivated is closer to the coastal areas, right? When you are closer to the sea, obviously the RH will be high because the sea is the land, uh, sea is the largest water body, right? So because of that evaporation happens and wind flows, right? We will have high RH, especially in the lowland areas where rice is cultivated. But if you go to the hill country, right, maybe in earlier Hatton, maybe there's a chance for the RH to go down, right? But majority of the rice growing locations are in the low country, so the rice, so they experience the RH value of 80 to 85%, right? So high RH, but the problem with if this increase maybe to 90% or 95%, right? So the problem we'll have is the pest and disease problem, right? Pest and disease problem. And also, as I said, when this high RH overlap with high temperature, in the previous slide, around 36 Celsius, when they overlap or coincide with a high relative humidity, there's a chance for the sterility in grains, right? So then yield will be affected, right? So the high relative humidity problem are two. One is they can increase the pest and disease problems. And other thing is that if they coincide with high temperature, right, then there's a chance for sterility, especially during the reproductive stages of rice, right? And then regarding the wind, right? Wind, uh, it's also required, but gentle wind, or maybe you can call it as mild wind, right? Mild wind, right? During the growing period is required, right? Because that will support the pollination because we said that it's a self-pollinated crop, right? And also it will increase the turbulence around the canopy. Rice, if you imagine a rice field, right? The plants are nearby, right? Very close to each other, right? So they are very close to each other. So when they do photosynthesis, right? Photosynthesis, they need carbon dioxide, right? High amount of carbon dioxide is required, right? So near to the canopy, right? Canopy means the collection of leaves, right? In any crop, right? So near to the canopy, since they continuously uptake carbon dioxide during the daytime, right? When the sunlight is there, right? They will continue to absorb CO2, right? So then there will be, right, a deficit around the canopy for the carbon dioxide, right? So when there's a mild wind, right? So when wind moves, right, it will replace with the new air, right? So continuously replacing that old air with the new air, right? So that will have rich amount of carbon dioxide, right? So then they can continue to do photosynthesis, right, without any limitation for CO2, right? So that small turbulence, right, or gentle wind will help the plant and also to the pollination. But as you know, the heavy winds, right, may damage the crop and also desiccate the crop because of the transpiration losses, right? When the wind speed is high, you may have studied that transpiration rate is high, right? So then they will lose water, right? Plants will lose water. So then it will desiccate the crop. And also it can spread diseases from nearby fields. If it is heavy winds, that will bring this disease causing pathogens or agents, right? So that is a problem with these heavy winds, right? So that should be mild wind or gentle wind, right? I hope I can finish the water requirement also and the soil requirement, right? So the water requirement, if you take water requirement, right, you can imagine, right? The lowland rice requires a lot of water, right? Because we grow rice in a standing water, right? So the average requirement for irrigated rice, right? So you have studied rice can be grown, right, under different systems. For the irrigated rice, right, during the season, right? So it ranges 1,000 to 2,000 millimeter, right? So that's the in depth, right? We provide the water requirement, right? So if you want to convert it into volume, then you can have the area, right, and multiply it, and then you can find it in a volume, right? But we can always mention it in the depth, right? Whenever we irrigate the crop, we measure the water requirement in terms of depth of irrigation, right? So that is 1,000 to 2,000 millimeter, right? If you want to, you can convert into centimeter, right? It's up to you, right? All right. So this is the requirement. It has generally, right? Generally, but you should know this water requirement varies depending on the growing season, right? Growing season, climatic conditions, soil type, right? Hydrological conditions, right? Of the environment where you grow rice, it will vary. For example, you may have like a longer duration variety, then obviously you need a lot of water, right? And then under the climate, if you are growing rice under dry climate, your water requirement will increase, right? If you have like a soil that loses water fastly, right? For example, maybe sandy loam, right? You have to have a lot of water. But if you grow in a clay soil, right, then it will hold the water, right? Then your water requirement will be less, right? So like that, right? Depending on the field conditions, the water requirement varies, but average is around 1,000 to 2,000 millimeters. So this third point, right? Third point. So this is calculated by this International Rice Research Institute. So they on average, right? On average, they calculated. So they say that it takes around 1,432 liters of water to produce 1 kilogram of rice in an irrigated lowland system, right? So if it is a different system, obviously the requirement will be different, right? So since this is the irrigated lowland system, so they say that you need 1,432 liters to produce 1 kilogram of rice. Okay, that's kind of a water footprint of rice, right? In the lowland production system, right? Irrigated lowland production system. And then irrigated rice usually receive, right? Again, irrigated rice, right? Usually receive an estimated around like 34 to 43% of the total world's irrigation water, right? Irrigation water, and about 24 to 30% of the entire world's freshwater resources, right? So, you know, rice is an important crop, especially in the Asian region, right? And also other regions, right? So if you estimate how much water is used for rice, right? Total rice cultivated in the world, right? So that is 34 to 43% of the total world's irrigation water, right? So if you take that total as a total irrigation water, that is 34 to 43%. But if you take the total freshwater resources, from that 24 to 30% is used for rice alone, right? Rice alone. And another information you should know that it's kind of a general knowledge, right? If you take freshwater resources, right, 70% of the freshwater resources we use for irrigation for all the crops around the world. 70% is used for irrigation, right? So that is kind of a statistics. We have total freshwater resources because we have to use always the freshwater resources, right? Because the quality of the water also important for irrigation, right? You cannot apply saline water, right? You cannot apply saline water to rice or any other crop, right? So you have to um, go for the freshwater resources, or unless you go for maybe desalination techniques or something. Okay, so this water requirement continues, right? I will quickly finish this one. So continuous flooding of water generally provides the best growing environment for rice, right? So that's why still large extent is grown, large extent of rice is grown under the continuous flooding, right? After transplanting, water levels should be around 3 centimeter initially, right? So that's you have to maintain 3 centimeter depth of water, right? And then you have to gradually increase 5 to 10 centimeter with increasing plant height, right? Because when they grow, you also need to increase uh, the depth of the water, right? And then this water level you have to maintain, right? Around 5 to 10 centimeter you have to maintain until the field is trained. 1 week before harvest, right? A week before harvest, we have to train the field, right? So we train means you have to remove the water, right? Through your canals and all, right? So until that you have to maintain this. This is the kind of a recommended depth of water you have to maintain for flooded rice, right? Flooded rice. And then this table shows, right, kind of a water requirement from the past data, right? So this is for the different operations involved in rice. For nursery, we need 40 millimeter, right? Land preparation also require 200 millimeter, right? You have to, do puddling, leveling, right? You may have studied in the practical, but we'll cover it, right? In the management practices. And then for field irrigation, around 1,000, right? So the total, they say around 1,240 millimeter. But you should know, we should not blindly remember these values, right? Because it varies, it widely varies with all the environmental conditions, field conditions, and all, right? It's kind of a general average, right? Overall average. And also this table is divided the same water requirement by the growth stages, right? Again, nursery, right? And then main field preparation 200. But after that, they have divided by the growth stages, right? From planting to panicle initiation, this much. Panicle initiation to flowering, this much. Flowering to maturity, this much, right? After flowering, we need the amount is a little bit less, right? 125 millimeter, right? But still we need, right? Or if you add, this also will come like 1240, right? Millimeter, right? So that's kind of a general requirement we have. And then, right? Briefly, I will go through the soil requirement, right? Usually, this rice is grown in wide range of soils with substantially high percentage of clay-lium soil, right? Uh, because clay soil is needed to stagnate water, right? If you want to maintain the depth of water, right? That's the water retention, right? So you need clay, right? Clay soil. So if it is, it will leach and go away, right? You cannot store water, right? So high amount of clay and organic matter is ideal, and then this is the preferred range of pH. Soil pH, soil pH is very important for the crops, right? So 5.6 to 7, and then these clay soils will have many fine particles that will hold water and nutrients, right? Nutrients. So that I will again go through the soil briefly before I start the next class. So with that, I will conclude. Are there any important questions before we wind up? Any questions? So already I have uploaded study. I hope you all uploaded the assignment, and I will take a look. Any questions? So if you don't have questions, we can end this lecture today. Then we will meet next class. But I have to have another 1 hour to cover the next class. So I'll talk to the Dutch chef and arrange that. Thank you.